Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
First this morning, Theresa May is proposing what she is calling tough new rules to penalise company executives who try to line their own pockets by putting their workers' pensions at risk. An unacceptable abuse, she says, that will end. Her comments come as the government attempts to seize the initiative after the collapse of the giant construction services and outsourcing company Carillon, which went into liquidation on Monday with debts of around £1.5 billion.
One of Britain's biggest construction firms, Carillon, has been put into liquidation. 20,000 workers face an uncertain future.
Carillon employed people providing essential services in our schools, hospitals, railways and prisons. They had to be told they would be paid when they turned up to work on Monday.
And let me be clear that all employees should continue to turn up to work confident in the knowledge that they will be paid for the public services that they are providing.
The firm had around 450 contracts with government on top of private work and overseas projects. Some of those had been handed to the company after it issued profit warnings last year.
Prime Minister, why were contracts awarded to Carillon despite the warnings?
Labour and the unions wanted answers.
Why did the government not heed the warnings? Why did they continue to give billions of pounds of contracts to a company that the city were backing against in 2013? That's the real question.
And it's emerged the firm's former chief executive, Richard Howson, who left the firm last year, received £1.5 million in pay and bonuses in 2016. While many ordinary employees face the prospect of being laid off, and a huge black hole in the company's pension scheme could result in their pensions being slashed. Subcontractors who hadn't been paid for weeks were warned they might get just 1 penny for every pound they're owed. Some warned that they too might go to the wall.
We're not really a business of a size that can trade through that without some form of support from the government. If it's not forthcoming, I think ourselves and lots of businesses like us will probably go out of business.
In the wake of the collapse of the contract...
For Labour, though, this was not just about the failure of one company. By Monday night, Jeremy Corbyn had taken to social media. At Prime Minister's questions, he pressed the point home.
This isn't one isolated case of government negligence and corporate failure. It's a broken system.
Virgin and Stagecoach's management of East Coast trains, Capita and Atos's handling of disability assessments, and security firm G4S's failure to provide security at the Olympics were all examples, according to Jeremy Corbyn, of the private sector failing the public sector.
These corporations, Mr. Speaker, need to be shown the door. We need our public services provided by public employees with a public service ethos and a strong public oversight. As the ruins of Carillon lie around her, will the Prime Minister act to end this costly racket?
Theresa May pointed out it was the Blair and Brown governments that signed many of the big public-private partnership deals, and she suspected there was something else behind the current Labour leadership's hostility to the private sector.
But what Labour oppose isn't just a role for private companies in public services, but the private sector as a whole. This is a Labour Party that has turned its back on investment, on growth, on jobs. A Labour Party that will always put politics before people.
So under a Labour government, how far would their nationalisation plans go? Would every binman, builder and even bankers have to be employed by the state? So Carillon's collapse is the big story of the week, and it will continue to have political consequences that I will talk through now with the panel. Tom Newton-Dunn, it's presumably the collapse of Carillon that's prompted this promise from Theresa May today that she will punish bosses who have got big black holes in their pension funds but continue to take bonuses themselves. Is this something very new?
This is very much our expectation that the Prime Minister has acted dramatically as a response to Carillon's collapse last week. The only problem is, I recall a certain party conference speech the Prime Minister gave in October 2016. It was the Citizens of Nowhere speech. He was calling out all the rotten, corrupt apples across the country then. Philip Green was prominent in that, who of course had just presided over the collapse of BHS, leaving a massive pensions black hole. An entire year and a bit has passed and no apparent government action. So I fear Theresa May, with all these bold words in the New Look Observer this morning, is still behind the curb on this, and action this day, it's still going to be looking like action tomorrow.
Yeah, but it's still what people want to hear, isn't it? That action will be taken to at least stop this happening again?
Well, certainly people do want to hear it, although they're amazed it hasn't happened before. But I think actually Jeremy Corbyn is playing this beautifully, and there is a much more worrying, bigger picture here for the Conservatives, in that the opportunity that they have created for Jeremy Corbyn to underline his case that unfettered free markets don't work, and that somehow or other Carillon symbolises everything that is wrong about the system, as we heard him say there on that clip. Now, I don't think most voters are actually particularly ideological. They just want things to work. But if the government is seen to be incompetent on this scale, it does create the vacuum for the leader of the Labour Party to put an ideological spin on it, and he's doing that very effectively.
I mean, what the Prime Minister was pointing to, and she is right, when she says far more of these PFI contracts were signed under Blair and Brown than have been under subsequent Tory governments. But now that you've got a Corbyn Labour Party in opposition, they don't really have to shoulder the blame for that, presumably, and can be
no,
highly critical.
Jeremy Corbyn opposed them at the time. I think what we're seeing here is the late 1970s in reverse. Then you had a minority Labour government being torn apart by ideological tides moving away from it. Now we have a minority Conservative government being challenged by tidal waves which put them on the defensive all the time. We haven't got time to go through other examples, but just on this one. As Tom said, Theresa May is quite well equipped in some ways to respond, because from the very beginning she taught the language of corporate governance and intervention, and we're coming after the bad people in the private sector. But because of the lack of action to follow that up, and because Jeremy Corbyn genuinely believes in these things, it's much easier for him to swim with these tidal waves than her leading this deeply pressurised minority government.
OK, well, we've been talking to all three of you through the course of the programme, but let's pick up on Carillon with the Shadow Attorney General, Labour's Shami Chakrabarti, who's here in the studio. Welcome.
Good morning.
Labour have been very critical of the government's response to Carillon's collapse. What would Labour have done differently this week after they found out how much trouble Carillon was in if you'd been in government?
Well, I think what we would do and what we will do as soon as we are in government is look in a far more fundamental way at PFI, at outsourcing. And by the way,
and we'll get on to the principles of this. But if you had won the election in 2017, it would have been a Labour government that had to handle this collapse. What would have been different in your response?
I don't think we would have left it so late. I don't think we would have just soldiered on bailing out a company that already had raised serious warning signals in the city. I don't think we would have allowed them to get into subcontracting arrangements with, for example, Serco, worth, again, millions and millions of pounds when there are profit warnings against that company too. I mean,
but this is it now. So Serco are a big government provider. If you're saying the government should have intervened earlier with Carillon, should they be looking at all their contracts with the likes of Serco, who have also issued profit warnings?
I think you do need to look at all of these arrangements and the subcontracting arrangements. By the way, it's not because I'm ideologically opposed to the private sector, and it will be a lot of smaller private sector companies that will really suffer as a result of non-payment, for example, under contractual arrangements with these great big beasts.
So should they get some government help? I mean, we heard the man running the small business in the film there saying they might go to the wall unless there's some government help.
Quite possibly, but with accountability. And I think it's all very well for Mrs May to now say she's going to sting these executives. There's got to be a little bit of ministerial responsibility in all of this as well. And one of my concerns is that when vital public services of a kind that are almost constitutional, for example prisons, get contracted out, what you're actually devolving is ministerial responsibility. And then something goes terribly wrong, whether in a vital utility responsibility, or whether it's a matter of security or infrastructure, and ministers of whatever colour just put their hands up and say, it's wicked executives, it's the wicked company. And what we need is ministerial responsibility. What we need is oversight. Of course we want a thriving private sector, but some vital services need to be run by public servants and with ministers held to account.
Sometimes when you hear Labour shadow ministers talking about this, it sounds as though they want to take absolutely everything back into public ownership, all the catering, all the cleaning, every service.
I believe in a mixed economy, and I know that my colleagues do too. But there are times when some things need to be in public hands. Now that will include on constitutional grounds, where you're talking about people's human rights, people's basic security. That will also mean sometimes when you have a big organisation and outsourcing is used to grind down the working conditions of some workers and break down the sense of community and solidarity between them.
So where is it appropriate for there to be private contracts?
Well, where is it? Well, for example, you know, there are some things that the private sector probably does better. When you're running a police force, you're unlikely to say we'll make the motorbikes for the police officers better than BMW. Maybe you will, but I doubt that that's going to happen anytime soon. So you need to look at this.
But what about cleaning in the offices and the police stations? Should that be outsourced, or should that be actually run by the police?
I think that in some circumstances, I think maybe hospitals are a better example, because of course cleanliness in a hospital is quite often a matter of life and death. So I think sometimes it is better, even for something that seems, you know, not a core service like cleaning, to be in public hands. You just need to look at this on a case-by-case basis, both in terms of...
I'm not hearing very many examples of where you think it is appropriate for private companies to be involved. So you've discussed prisons and probation. What about catering in prisons? Does that have to be in public hands, or could that be done by a private company?
I think what you want to do is to look at the quality of the service, the quality of the conditions for the people working there, and to see what would be best value for the public and for the public purse. It's not ideological, but in some cases there are principles at stake. I do agree.
And we are still left with the problem here of workers who are worried about their pension, who've been working for Carillon, and subcontractors who may not get paid. If the government were to talk about putting some taxpayers' money into helping out either those people or those companies, would the Labour Party object?
I think we would want to look at what the conditions are of spending public money.
But in principle, you could spend public money on people. It's not the fault of the subcontracting small companies who are now not going to get paid.
Well, indeed, but you want accountability. If you do decide to spend public money, for example, to help those smaller businesses, you want some accountability in response. And you might well want to legislate to give priority to pension funds, for example, over shareholders who have not really done their job of corporate governance in these cases.
We'll move on and talk about something else, if you don't mind, the John Warboys case, the serial sex attacker. Yeah. This time last week, we were sitting here talking about the fact that the Justice Minister said he would launch a judicial review. Now he said that he won't, because there's little chance of it succeeding.
Indeed.
Should the government be pursuing a judicial review? Would Labour, if they were in power?
My view at the time, and I decided to sort of hold my tongue about it because I'm used to politicians waving in a kind of knee-jerk way when there's a case of this kind. My view is that if there is to be a judicial review of the parole board decision, the best person to bring such a judicial review would be a victim, because the chances are their best arguments would be under the Human Rights Act, which gives rights to victims and not to politicians. So I think
there's a crowdfunding attempt to raise the money to do that.
Frankly, if the Justice Secretary wants to make a name for himself with this as a new Justice Secretary, he might better give his attentions to making sure that people have decent levels of legal aid, so that they can vindicate their rights under the Human Rights Act. I also think, in relation to the Warboys case and the crisis of public confidence that it's in danger of creating, we could do with an end-to-end review of the whole case, from the moment a young woman went to the police and was disbelieved to the moment this release decision was made, arguably with a lack of transparency and involvement of victims.
Because he was prosecuted for offences against 12 women, and we know there were almost 100 other women who came forward, but the CPS say they can't go forward with those cases. They looked at them, they decided there wasn't enough evidence, and they can't revisit that decision. If there wasn't enough evidence then, there won't be enough evidence now.
I want to look at the... I'm not second-guessing the particular CPS decisions, because I'm not in a position to do that, but I do think that there are issues for the whole system, from the moment that a woman went to the police and was not treated with the respect that she deserved, to the moment that this release decision was made, it would seem, on everyone's analysis, without proper input or consultation or even notice to victims.
Now, of course, it was Labour's Shadow Brexit Secretary, Keir Starmer, who was the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time when the case was prosecuted. And he said he didn't have any involvement in the decision-making behind it.
Nor did his predecessor. He says, but that's not
But
that's
they
not
should
my
have
point.
done, shouldn't they? Shouldn't the DPP have been looking at something? You've got over 100 women reporting that this man has raped them and he's prosecuted for only 12 cases. The DPP should be involved in that.
Whoever was the DPP, my argument is that this whole story and this whole case and the numbers of women involved and, frankly, the anxiety that this decision has caused to women who weren't even victims means there needs to be an end-to-end review of how the system has worked in this case, from the moment a woman went to the police and was arguably not believed to the moment that this release decision was made without the input of victims who I would expect to be at least given notice and the opportunity to make representations to the parole board.
There's a story running in the Sunday Times this morning about Momentum, saying that they're trying to deselect 50
an
Labour
anonymous
MPs.
Source has given... look...
Yeah, now, of course, the fact of the matter is Momentum, where there have been parliamentary selections, Momentum candidates have won only in 5 of the last 25 selections. Does that not worry you? Do you not think that, actually, the Labour Parliamentary Party should better reflect the membership and Corbyn's leadership?
Look, my understanding is that Momentum is not prioritising the selection of some candidates over others. They are, an invigorated movement, part of the Labour movement, which has always had various strands within it. What is exciting to me, it's clearly not exciting to the Sunday Times, fair enough, is that we've now got about 600,000 members. And we have a democratic party that's becoming more democratic.
So you must want the MPs to be more in tune with the membership, because there is still a massive disconnect between those who sit in Parliament and those who've joined the party since Corbyn became leader.
Well, I think these things can be exaggerated. I've personally, in the Palace of Westminster, noticed a real change since the general election. People uniting around a sense of purpose, not least around scandals like Carillon. So fair enough, it's a good story for the Sunday Times, but I don't really spot this red menace in the way that other people do. This is a democratic party. It's a mass popular movement of about 600,000 people, and I think that's something to be quite optimistic about.
All right. Well, Shami Chakrabarti, thanks very much for talking to us this morning, and I shall turn back to the panel and start with you, Steve. I mean, should Labour MPs be worried that Momentum are coming to try and deselect them, or is this being rather overblown? They haven't been that successful thus far in doing so.
Yeah, no, I think it's been overblown just on the basis of the evidence. I mean, you quoted it then, of the selection procedures that's taken place so far. They haven't prevailed that often, and in the Sunday Times today they resorted to the example of Haringey Council, where I happen to live, where there are a lot of specific local issues. So at this point, it is not at all clear whether deselection will become the overwhelming theme over the next few years in the Labour Party. It might do, but the evidence so far is that it's much more nuanced than some newspapers are suggesting.
3 new Momentum-backed members on the ruling body of the Labour Party, the NEC, this week. That's going to make a difference, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely huge difference, because Jeremy Corbyn and his wing of the party can now do precisely what they want, and as long as they have union muscle behind them during conference votes, which formalise decisions made by the NEC, then the party, and any which way he wants to run it, is his. I disagree with Steve. I think, the difference in language that Jeremy Corbyn and his very close associates were using after the NEC elections this week on mandatory re-selections. Shami wasn't actually asked whether she thoroughly believed in them or not. Jeremy Corbyn was, Rebecca Long-Bailey also was, and both of them, crucially, refused to rule them out and refused even to say they were a bad thing. Simply that we hadn't taken that decision yet, we're not there yet. In my view, it is without doubt that Jeremy Corbyn will at some stage try and reshape the Parliamentary Labour Party more in his image. And you may well argue, Shami's views would be interesting, why on earth should he not do that?
And Shami was saying that the party is much more united around Jeremy Corbyn. And when we see a story like Carillon this week, it's much easier, isn't it, for him to get the backing of the Parliamentary Party and look like a more united
Well,
force.
I think that's right. But I mean, back to what we were talking about before, how unpleasant and how ugly and how divisive is it to have these stories out, whether or not they're completely accurate or whoever is briefing. I think it looks very, very bad on the atmosphere of the parliamentary party. Where I do think that Shami has a good point is on the size of the Labour membership. 600,000. I mean, the Conservatives can only dream of getting a fraction of this. So clearly there is a big problem for the Tory party there in matching what Labour is doing.
OK, and so before we leave this, we should ask you, Shami, mandatory reselections for Labour MPs, are you in favour?
I think that there should, whatever democratic process there should be across the board and for everyone. My experience is that where MPs are doing a good job, including working with their membership, and you have to work with your membership to get the vote out in the Labour Party, that relationship works well, and I think that relationship will only work better into the future. I've been all over the country. I've been to all sorts of CLPs campaigning in recent times, not least because I don't have a constituency myself. And I think you'd be surprised at the number of places where there's actually a very happy relationship between the MP and the party, regardless of the particular strand that they come from.
All right, Shami, thank you very much for that.